The Texas sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty compound of Camp Swift, a newly established prisoner of war facility 30 miles east of Austin. In kitchens across America, mothers poured fresh coffee for their sons home on leave. In factories, workers took their breaks with steaming cups that fueled another shift of war production. But in a small section of Camp Swift, separated from the main facility by barbed wire and wooden watchtowers, 43 German women prisoners were about to encounter something they hadn't experienced in years: the rich, unmistakable aroma of real American coffee. These weren't the first prisoners to arrive at Camp Swift. Thousands of German soldiers already occupied the main compound, working in nearby fields and factories as the war effort demanded. But the women were different. They required separate facilities, female guards, and created an unusual situation that nobody in the Texas command structure quite knew how to handle. When the transport trucks rolled through the gates that September morning, they carried women who had crossed an ocean as enemies of America, now facing an uncertain future in a landscape as foreign to them as the moon. 24-year-old Elsa Hoffman stepped down from the truck first, her gray auxiliary uniform dusty from the long journey from the East Coast Processing Center. She had been a radio operator in France, captured when Allied forces overran her communications post in the final days of the Normandy campaign. Behind her came the others, ranging in age from 19 to 37, each carrying a small bag of personal belongings and expressions that mixed exhaustion with carefully maintained dignity. They had been taught to expect cruelty from their American captors. They had been warned about the barbaric treatment that awaited prisoners in enemy hands. Instead, they found themselves in a place that looked nothing like the Europe they had left behind. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, flat and vast under a sky bigger than any they had ever seen. The air smelled of dry grass, dust, and something else, something that made Elsa stop mid-step and inhale deeply. Her companion, 19-year-old Marguerite Schmidt, noticed it too. "Coffee," Marguerite whispered in German, her voice cracking slightly. Real coffee. It had been more than 2 years since either of them had smelled the genuine article. In Germany, coffee had become a distant memory, replaced by bitter ersatz substitutes made from roasted acorns, chicory, and whatever else could be ground and brewed. The aroma drifting from the camp kitchen was like a ghost from a previous life, a reminder of normalcy before the world had torn itself apart. Before we discover how a simple cup of coffee would transform these women's understanding of their enemies, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story of how these women came to be prisoners in Texas began 18 months earlier, in the spring of 1943, when Germany's war effort desperately needed every available person. Elsa Hoffman had been working as a telephone operator in Hamburg when the recruitment officers arrived at her workplace. The Women's Auxiliary Corps needed educated young women who could handle communications equipment, they said. It was a chance to serve the fatherland, to free up men for combat duty, to be part of something greater than herself. She had signed the papers that same afternoon, believing she was joining a defensive effort to protect her country from invasion. Marguerite Schmidt's path had been different, but led to the same destination. The daughter of a baker in Munich, she had joined the auxiliary service to escape her father's expectation that she would marry the grocer's son and spend her life behind a counter. The military offered adventure, purpose, and a uniform that made her feel like she belonged to something important. She had never fired a weapon, never saw combat, but she had been trained to operate field radios and decode messages. When the Allies landed in Normandy, she found herself stationed at a communications hub in Caen, monitoring radio traffic and passing messages up the command chain. Neither woman had imagined they would become prisoners. The German High Command had assured them that women in auxiliary roles would be evacuated before any danger arrived. But the Allied advance moved faster than anyone anticipated. Elsa's unit found itself surrounded when American forces pushed through their sector. Marguerite's communication post was overrun in the chaos of retreat. Suddenly, they were no longer serving their country. They were prisoners of war, loaded onto trucks with dozens of other captured women, beginning a journey that would take them across the Atlantic. The voyage to America had been surreal. Transported on a converted cargo ship, the German women prisoners were kept separate from male prisoners, housed in cramped quarters below deck. They had expected mistreatment, perhaps even violence. Instead, they found themselves guarded by American military police, who treated them with formal correctness, providing adequate food and medical care. It was confusing, this unexpected decency from people they had been taught to view as brutal enemies. During the crossing, Elsa had written in a small notebook she had managed to keep through her capture, trying to make sense of her reversed fortune. 3 months ago I was listening to radio broadcasts, promising final victory. Now I'm sailing to America, as a prisoner. Everything I believed about this war, about our enemies, about my own purpose, all of it seems uncertain now. The processing center in New York had been overwhelming, a massive facility handling thousands of prisoners arriving from European battlefields. Then came the train journey across America, watching through barred windows as an enormous country unfolded before them, seemingly untouched by war. Jake Morrison had never expected his war service would involve guarding German women prisoners. The 42-year-old rancher from Bastrop County had been too old for combat duty when America entered the war, but his expertise with horses and his steady temperament made him valuable to the military in other ways. The Army needed men who could maintain order at the rapidly expanding prisoner of war camps across Texas, men who understood discipline but also possessed the patience required for managing large groups. Jake had signed up thinking he would guard dangerous enemy soldiers. Instead, he found himself assigned to the women's section of Camp Swift, a job that left him more uncomfortable than facing down a charging bull. Standing beside Jake at the morning briefing was Tommy Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from Houston whose family ran a successful restaurant downtown. Tommy had volunteered for military service to prove his loyalty to America, still stinging from the suspicion some neighbors directed toward anyone who looked Asian after Pearl Harbor. He spoke fluent Cantonese and English, had studied some German in high school, and possessed a natural gift for putting people at ease. The Army had assigned him to Camp Swift specifically because of his language skills and his ability to bridge cultural divides. Looking at the transport trucks arriving with their cargo of exhausted German women, Tommy felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. They looked like his younger sisters might look if circumstances had been different, if fortune had placed them on the other side of this terrible war. The third key figure in the Guard contingent was Miguel Rodriguez, a 31-year-old cowboy whose family had been ranching in Texas since before it was Texas, when it was still part of Mexico. Miguel understood what it meant to be viewed with suspicion despite being on your own land. His great-grandfather had fought at the Alamo, his grandfather had served in the Confederate Army, and his father had worked cattle on the same ranch where Miguel learned to ride before he could walk. Miguel had seen enough of life to know that enemies were often just people born in the wrong place at the wrong time. When the camp commander assigned him to help oversee the women's facility, he had simply nodded and asked what needed to be done. These 3 men, products of different American experiences but united by their sense of duty, would become the primary point of contact between the German prisoners and their new reality. They stood watching as Elsa, Margarete, and the other women were processed through the camp entrance, noting the mixture of fear and defiance in the prisoners' eyes. Captain Wilson, the camp commander, had given them clear instructions: maintain security, ensure compliance with camp regulations, and treat the prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards. What the captain hadn't told them was how to handle the strange responsibility of being jailers to women who looked like they should be teaching school or working in offices, not standing in a prison camp in rural Texas. That first evening in the barracks, as the Texas heat slowly released its grip on the day, the German women gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices about their new surroundings. Elsa sat on her assigned bunk, a thin mattress on a metal frame that was still more comfortable than anything she had slept on during the final months in France. Beside her, Marguerite stared at the ceiling, her hands folded across her stomach. "Do you remember real coffee?" Marguerite asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, truly remember it, not just the idea of it?" Elsa closed her eyes, reaching back through years of deprivation to memories of her childhood. "Sunday mornings," she said softly. "My mother would grind the beans fresh. The smell would fill our entire apartment. My father would read the newspaper, and I would sit at the table doing my schoolwork, and that aroma, it meant everything was normal, everything was safe." She opened her eyes, finding them unexpectedly wet. "I haven't smelled real coffee since 1942, maybe 1941. Across the barracks, 33-year-old Hannah Kruger overheard the conversation and joined them, settling onto the edge of Elsa's bunk. She had been a nurse before the war, and her practical nature made her a natural leader among the prisoners. "The ersatz they gave us in the Auxiliary Corps," she said with a bitter laugh. I think they made it from burned tree bark and optimism. It was brown, it was hot, and that was the only similarity to actual coffee. My grandmother sent me a package once. She had somehow obtained real beans through the black market. 3 precious beans. I ground them myself, mixed them with the ersatz to make them last. That 1 cup, it tasted like the world before the war. Other women drifted over, drawn by the conversation and the comfort of shared memory. Greta Fischer, a 21-year-old from Berlin, admitted she could barely remember what real coffee tasted like. I was 17 when the war started, she said. My whole adult life has been rationing and substitutes. My mother used to talk about coffee like it was a fairy tale, something magical that existed in the past, but not in our world anymore. She had tried making ersatz from roasted chickpeas once, following a recipe from a government pamphlet promising it would taste almost like the real thing. It had tasted like dirt water. The conversation revealed how deeply the small deprivations of war had cut into their lives. Coffee was just one item on a long list of things that had vanished from daily existence: bread without sawdust, meat more than once a week, chocolate, butter, soap that actually cleaned. But somehow coffee represented more than simple luxury. It symbolized normalcy, civilization, the peaceful life they had lost. None of them knew that within hours they would encounter the real thing again, or that this simple beverage would begin to reshape their understanding of their captors. Jake Morrison noticed it during the morning roll call. The way the German women's eyes followed the guards carrying coffee cups from the mess hall, it wasn't the hungry look of people wanting food. It was something else, something deeper. Recognition mixed with longing. He had seen similar expressions on the faces of cattle during a drought, watching storm clouds that never delivered rain. The observation stuck with him as he made his rounds that September morning, checking the fence lines and ensuring everything was secure. That evening, Jake drove his truck back to his family's ranch, 15 miles from Camp Swift. His wife Sarah was setting the table for dinner when he walked in, and she immediately knew something was troubling him. "You've got that look," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "The one you get when something's bothering your conscience." Jake hung his hat on the hook by the door and sank into his chair. "Those German women at the camp," he began slowly. "They're just girls, really. Most of them younger than our daughter would be if we'd been blessed with children. Today I saw them watching us drink coffee, like we were holding liquid gold." Sarah poured him a cup from the pot on the stove, the rich aroma filling their small kitchen. Her grandfather had been German, immigrated to Texas in the 1880s. She still kept some of his old letters, written in a language she couldn't read but treasured nonetheless. "What are you thinking, Jake?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Her husband had always had a soft heart beneath his rough exterior. Jake wrapped his hands around the warm cup, staring into the dark liquid. "I'm thinking that showing a little Christian kindness doesn't make a person unpatriotic," he said finally. "I'm thinking that those women are prisoners of circumstance more than anything else, and I'm thinking that nobody should have to go years without tasting real coffee." Sarah nodded slowly, then walked to their pantry. She returned with a small burlap sack, their personal supply of coffee beans. They were careful with it, knowing that even in America, rationing meant coffee was precious. But they weren't suffering like people in Europe. They still had enough. "Take what you need," she told her husband. "If our positions were reversed, if our daughter was a prisoner somewhere, I'd hope someone would show her such kindness." Jake looked at his wife with the same appreciation he had felt on their wedding day 30 years earlier. "I'll take just enough for 1 pot," he said, "just to see if it makes a difference." The next morning, Jake Morrison arrived at Camp Swift an hour early. In the back of his truck sat a battered old coffee pot from his ranch, a bag of carefully measured beans, and a determination to do something that probably violated a dozen regulations. Tommy Chen, arriving for his shift, saw Jake's preparations and simply asked, "Need any help with that, boss?" The morning of September 15th began like any other at the women's section of Camp Swift. The prisoners filed out of their barracks at 6:30 for morning roll call, standing in neat rows as the pale Texas dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Elsa took her usual place in the front row, Margaretti beside her, both women's faces carefully composed in the neutral expression they had learned to wear in captivity. They expected the routine announcement of work assignments, the same monotonous schedule that had defined their days since arrival. Instead, they saw Jake Morrison standing beside a small folding table that hadn't been there the day before. On the table sat an old blue enamel coffee pot, steam rising gently from its spout, and a collection of mismatched tin cups. The aroma that drifted across the assembly area made every woman freeze mid-breath. It was unmistakable, impossible, and yet undeniably real. Fresh coffee. Not the bitter institutional brew they could sometimes smell from the main camp kitchen. This was different. This was the real thing, rich and dark and full of promise. Tommy Chen stepped forward, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. "The guards," he began in his careful English, then repeated in slower, simpler German, for those who struggled with the language, "have brought something to share with you this morning." A gesture of, he paused, searching for the right word, humanity. No one moved. The German women stood frozen, uncertain if this was some kind of test or trick. Years of deprivation and disappointment had taught them to be suspicious of unexpected kindness. But the aroma kept drifting toward them, impossible to ignore, calling to memories they had tried to bury. Jake Morrison picked up the pot with his work-roughened hands and began pouring coffee into the first cup. "Ladies," he said, his Texas drawl somehow gentle despite his weathered appearance. "No tricks here. Just coffee. Real American coffee. We figured you might have been missing it." He held out the first cup toward Elsa, who stood closest to the table. She looked at the cup like it might burn her, her eyes moving from the dark liquid to Jake's face, searching for mockery or cruelty. She found neither. Just a middle-aged cowboy with kind eyes offering something simple and profound. Slowly, Elsa stepped forward and accepted the cup with both hands. The heat seeped through the tin into her palms. She raised it to her lips, hesitated one more moment, then took a small sip. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Her eyes closed involuntarily. Her shoulders, held rigid with military bearing for so many months, suddenly sagged. A sound escaped her throat, something between a sob and a sigh. Margaretti watched her friend's face transform, watched years of hardness crack and fall away, with a single taste of something ordinary made extraordinary by its absence. The coffee that morning changed something fundamental in the camp's atmosphere. As each woman received her cup, a wall that had existed between captors and captives began to develop cracks. Margaret took her sip and immediately began crying, tears streaming down her cheeks as she clutched the tin cup like it held something infinitely precious. Hannah Kruger, the practical nurse who rarely showed emotion, stood motionless for a full minute after her first taste, simply breathing in the steam with her eyes closed. Even Greta Fisher, who barely remembered real coffee, understood instinctively that she was experiencing something significant, something that transcended the simple act of drinking a hot beverage. Jake Morrison watched their reactions with a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. He hadn't expected such raw emotion. These were enemy soldiers, he reminded himself, women who had served the same regime that was killing American boys overseas. Yet standing in the morning light, watching them savor something as simple as coffee, he couldn't see enemies. He saw his neighbors, his wife's sewing circle, his niece who taught school in Austin. He saw people who had been ground down by circumstances larger than themselves, now experiencing a moment of unexpected grace. Miguel Rodriguez, observing from his post by the fence, made a decision. The next morning, he arrived with a bag of pan dulce sweet bread his mother had baked. "My mama makes extras for the church," he explained to Tommy Chen, who was helping him set up another impromptu sharing session. Figured these ladies might appreciate something besides camp food. The German women, emboldened by the previous day's coffee, accepted the bread with less hesitation. They bit into the soft, sugar-dusted pastries and discovered flavors that reminded them of bakeries in Hamburg and Berlin, of Sunday mornings and family tables. The sharing became contagious. Tommy Chen brought in a book of English phrases he had written out in careful script, offering to teach anyone interested. Within a week, a dozen women were attending his informal classes during their free time, sitting in the shade of the barracks and practicing pronunciation. Private Eddie Walsh, a young guard from Boston, started bringing his harmonica and playing songs during the evening roll call. At first, the German women just listened. Then Hannah began humming along. Soon others joined in, their voices tentatively finding harmonies. The transformation wasn't complete or universal. Some guards remained suspicious, maintaining strict professional distance. Some prisoners, particularly those who had lost family members to Allied bombing, couldn't bring themselves to accept kindness from their enemies. But the coffee had opened a door, and through that door came a stream of small gestures that accumulated into something larger. Each shared moment, whether a cup of coffee, a piece of sweet bread, or a simple English lesson, was a quiet rebellion against the hatred that had brought them all to this place. October brought cooler weather to central Texas and the first letters from Germany. The International Red Cross had been working to establish communication between prisoners and their families, a process complicated by the chaos of a collapsing Reich. When Captain Wilson announced that mail had arrived for some of the women, the entire barracks fell silent. Elsa stood with 17 other prisoners who had been called forward, her hands shaking as she accepted the thin envelope bearing her mother's handwriting. She waited until evening to open it, needing privacy for whatever news it contained. Sitting on her bunk with Margarete beside her for support, she carefully unfolded the single sheet of paper. Her mother's familiar script swam before her eyes as she read. Hamburg had been bombed again in July. Their apartment building no longer existed. Her mother was living in the basement of what had once been a church, sharing space with 30 other displaced families. Her father was missing, last seen heading to his factory job before a raid. Her younger brother had been conscripted at 17 and sent to the Eastern Front. No one had heard from him in 3 months. The letter contained no blame, no anger at Elsa for being captured. Only exhaustion seeped through every line. "Your father's savings are worthless now," her mother wrote. "We trade whatever we can find for food. Last week I traded my wedding ring for half a loaf of bread and considered myself lucky. I pray you are being treated well wherever you are. I pray you have food and shelter. Most of all, I pray this war ends before there is nothing left of us to save." Elsa read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept her few possessions. She did not cry. She had no tears left for a home that no longer existed. Around the barracks, similar scenes played out. Margarete learned that her father's bakery had burned during a raid. He survived but lost his livelihood and now worked clearing rubble for food rations. Hannah discovered that the hospital where she had trained no longer stood, and 2 of her nursing colleagues had been killed when the building collapsed. Greta's letter brought the worst news of all. Her entire family had perished when their neighborhood was firebombed. The letter came from a distant aunt, coldly informing her that she was the last of her immediate family line. That evening, Jake Morrison arrived with his coffee pot, as he had done every few days since that first morning. He found the German women subdued, their usual tentative conversations replaced by heavy silence. Tommy Chen quietly explained about the letters. Jake stood uncertainly, the coffee pot in his hand suddenly feeling inadequate. How could hot coffee address grief of such magnitude? Yet, he poured anyway, because it was all he had to offer, and sometimes, small comforts matter most. When large sorrows threaten to overwhelm everything, November brought an unexpected opportunity. The cotton harvest was reaching its peak across central Texas, and local farms were desperate for workers. Most able-bodied men were either overseas or working in defense industries, leaving fields that needed picking before the crop rotted. Captain Wilson received authorization from his superiors to allow prisoners to work on nearby farms under guard supervision, a program already successful with male prisoners across the state. The women would earn small wages, get them outside the barbed wire, and help the war effort by keeping American agriculture productive. Jake Morrison volunteered to supervise the work detail at the Henderson farm, a 200-acre cotton operation owned by a widow named Ruth Henderson and her 2 teenage sons. Mrs. Henderson had been skeptical when Captain Wilson first proposed using German prisoners, but labor shortages left her no choice. Her cotton was ready, and every day of delay meant lost revenue she couldn't afford. When Jake's truck arrived with 12 German women, including Elsa and Margarete, Mrs. Henderson stood on her porch with her arms crossed, her face revealing nothing. The women climbed down from the truck bed, stretching muscles cramped from the ride. They wore their auxiliary uniforms with work gloves provided by the camp, and they looked at the endless rows of white cotton bolls with mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Most had never seen cotton growing before, let alone picked it. Mrs. Henderson's younger son, 16-year-old Thomas, demonstrated the technique. "You grab the bowl like this," he showed them, pulling the fluffy white cotton away from its sharp pod. "Watch out for the points. They'll cut your fingers if you're not careful. Fill your sack, drag it to the wagon, and we'll weigh it at the end of the day." The work was harder than any of them expected. The Texas sun, still strong in November, beat down on their backs. The cotton sacks grew heavier with each handful. Their fingers began to bleed where the sharp pods caught skin despite the gloves. But there was something liberating about the labor. For months they had been confined, idle, their days measured in meaningless routines. Here in the field, under the vast Texas sky, they were doing something real, something productive. Elsa found herself falling into a rhythm, her hands moving automatically from plant to sack, her mind free to wander. By midday, Mrs. Henderson brought water and sandwiches to the field. She set them on the tailgate of her truck without ceremony, but Jake noticed she had packed enough for everyone, guards and prisoners alike. The German women ate sitting in the cotton rows, and for the first time since their capture, they laughed. Margarete made a joke about looking like snow creatures covered in white cotton fibers. Hannah pointed out that Greta had cotton stuck in her hair, like decorative flowers. The laughter was tentative at first, then genuine. By early December, the morning coffee ritual had become the most anticipated moment of each day at the women's section of Camp Swift. What had begun as Jake Morrison's solitary gesture had evolved into something more structured and communal. The guards rotated responsibility for bringing coffee, each contributing beans from their own rations. Miguel Rodriguez brought in a proper camp percolator from the supply depot. Tommy Chen requisitioned additional cups so every woman could have her own to keep and clean. The simple act of sharing coffee had transformed into something sacred, a daily ceremony that bridged the divide between prisoners and guards. The ritual followed an unspoken protocol. Each morning at 6:45, after roll call, the women would gather near the equipment shed where a long wooden table had been set up. The guards would arrive with the coffee pot already percolating, its familiar burbling sound like music in the pre-dawn quiet. Jake or Tommy would pour, and the women would file past, accepting their cups with quiet thanks spoken in improving English. Then, instead of immediately dispersing, they would stand in loose groups, sipping slowly, making the moment last. Conversations emerged from these gatherings, tentative at first, then increasingly substantial. Elsa discovered that Jake had lost a nephew at Guadalcanal. The information shocked her, forcing her to confront the fact that her hosts had suffered their own losses in this war. Yet Jake showed her no resentment, only a weary acceptance of tragedy's randomness. "War takes from everybody," he told her simply. "Doesn't matter which side you're standing on." Miguel shared stories about his family's ranch, describing the landscape and livestock with such affection that even the German women who had never left cities could picture it. His words painted Texas as a place of possibility, where hard work and integrity mattered more than where your grandparents had been born. Tommy Chen used the coffee gatherings to continue his English lessons, but the teaching flowed both ways now. The guards were learning German phrases, and the cultural exchange went beyond mere vocabulary. Marguerite taught them a German folk song about autumn harvests. Private Walsh played it on his harmonica after hearing it just once, and soon guards and prisoners were singing together in two languages. Hannah shared German Christmas traditions that reminded Mrs. Henderson's sons, who sometimes visited the camp, of their own family customs. The connections being forged over coffee cups were revealing uncomfortable truths about the arbitrary nature of nationality and enemy designation. The coffee ritual also provided a space for silent comfort. When Greta received another letter confirming more family deaths, she stood at the morning gathering, with tears running down her face. No one spoke. Elsa simply stood closer on one side, Anna Weber on the other. Jake poured her coffee with extra care, and Miguel offered her a clean handkerchief from his pocket. The message was clear without words. Grief was acknowledged here, sorrow was shared, and even enemies could witness each other's pain with compassion. December 24, 1944. The German women woke to find the camp transformed. During the night, guards had strung lights around the barracks, simple white bulbs that glowed softly in the pre-dawn darkness. Someone had cut a mesquite tree and erected it near the dining hall, decorating it with handmade ornaments crafted from tin cans and scrap paper. The effect was modest by any standard, but to women who expected to spend Christmas in bleak captivity, it was almost overwhelming. Elsa stood in the doorway of her barracks, staring at the lights, remembering Christmas markets in Hamburg that now existed only in memory. Captain Wilson had authorized a special Christmas program, influenced partly by humanitarian concerns and partly by the undeniable fact that the women's section had become the most peaceful, productive part of Camp Swift. The transformation of hostile prisoners into cooperative workers hadn't gone unnoticed by his superiors. At 10 o'clock that morning, local families began arriving, members of churches from nearby towns who had heard about the German women and wanted to extend Christian charity. They brought donated gifts, simple things like soap, writing paper, warm socks, and small tins of cookies. Mrs. Henderson arrived with her sons. Carrying a large basket of tamales her Mexican neighbors had helped her prepare. Jake Morrison brought something unexpected. A full sack of coffee beans, enough for weeks of morning rituals. "This is from folks around Bastrop," he explained to Elsa, who had become the unofficial liaison between prisoners and guards. "When word got around about what we've been doing here, people wanted to contribute. They figured if sharing coffee could turn enemies into something like friends, it was worth supporting." Elsa accepted the heavy sack with both hands, understanding that it represented more than caffeine and flavor. It was an investment in the fragile community they had been building, an acknowledgement that what was happening at Camp Swift mattered beyond the barbed wire fence. The afternoon brought the centerpiece of the celebration, a shared meal in the dining hall. The guards ate alongside the prisoners, a violation of protocol that Captain Wilson chose to ignore for the day. The menu mixed American and German traditions, ham and potatoes alongside stolen bread that Hannah and 2 others had baked, using ingredients donated by local families. Tommy Chen's mother had sent Chinese dumplings, adding yet another cultural element to the feast. Miguel contributed his family's recipe for buñuelos, crispy fried pastries dusted with cinnamon sugar. As evening approached, the group gathered around the mesquite tree. Private Walsh played Christmas carols on his harmonica, while the women sang, their voices blending German and English lyrics. They sang Silent Night in both languages simultaneously, creating an unexpected harmony that made several people weep openly. Jake stood with his arm around his wife Sarah, who had driven out for the celebration. "This is what winning looks like," she whispered to him. "Not defeating enemies but making them stop being enemies." Her husband nodded, too moved to speak, watching German women and American cowboys singing together under a Texas sky. January 1945 brought news that shattered whatever remained of the German women's understanding of their homeland. American newspapers began publishing accounts from Allied forces, advancing into Germany and Poland, discovering concentration camps that revealed systematic atrocities beyond anything the prisoners at Camp Swift had imagined possible. The reports started as rumors, whispered between guards who didn't know how to discuss such horrors with their German charges. Then, Captain Wilson made the difficult decision to allow the women access to newspapers and newsreel footage, believing they had a right to know what had been done in their country's name. Tommy Chen was tasked with translating the articles for those who still struggled with English. He sat in the common room with a dozen women gathered around him, reading from the New York Times about the liberation of Majdanek. His voice faltered multiple times as he described what American soldiers had found. Gas chambers disguised as showers, warehouses filled with shoes and eyeglasses, cremation ovens, and evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. The women listened in stunned silence, their faces draining of color as the full scope of the revelations became clear. Elsa sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of her chair until her knuckles turned white. "This cannot be real," she whispered in German. "This must be propaganda. Allied lies to make us seem like monsters." But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her voice. She remembered things she had dismissed or ignored during her service. Whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, trains passing through stations at night, carrying cargo no one discussed. The disappearance of Jewish neighbors from her Hamburg apartment building, dismissed at the time as relocations for labor purposes. Margarete began crying silently, tears streaming down her face without sound or movement. Hannah stood abruptly and left the room, unable to process the information while surrounded by others. Greta simply stared at the floor, her young face aged by the weight of complicity she hadn't known she carried. Over the following days, more information arrived. Photographs appeared in Life magazine, images so disturbing that Captain Wilson hesitated before making them available. But the women insisted on seeing them, driven by a terrible need to understand what their country had become while they served it. The revelation fractured something fundamental in their identities. They had joined the auxiliary service, believing they were defending Germany from invasion, supporting soldiers who protected their homeland. Now they confronted the possibility that they had been part of a regime that committed atrocities systematically and deliberately. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. How could the country that produced Beethoven and Goethe also produce Auschwitz and Treblinka? How could the same government that encouraged them to serve with pride also orchestrate such systematic evil? Jake Morrison found Elsa sitting alone by the fence one evening, her face illuminated by the guard tower lights. She looked up as he approached, her eyes hollow with shock. "How do we go home to that?" she asked him simply. How do we return to a country capable of such things? February brought official word from Washington regarding repatriation procedures. The war in Europe was entering its final phase, and plans were being developed to return German prisoners to their homeland once hostilities ceased. Captain Wilson received a thick folder of regulations and timelines, instructions for processing thousands of prisoners across dozens of camps. The women at Camp Swift would be among the first groups repatriated, given their small numbers and the logistical simplicity of their situation. He scheduled a meeting to inform them of the procedures, expecting relief that their captivity would soon end. Instead, he encountered profound ambivalence. The women gathered in the dining hall, listened as he explained the timeline. Likely departure in April or May, processing through displaced persons camps in Europe, then released to return to their home cities. Transportation and basic provisions would be provided. The Red Cross would assist in locating surviving family members. Everything would be done according to proper protocols. When he finished and asked if there were questions, the silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Elsa raised her hand, her voice steady but her eyes reflecting deep internal conflict. "Captain Wilson, what if some of us don't want to return immediately?" The question hung in the air like something physical. Captain Wilson had processed hundreds of prisoners during his military career, and every single one had been eager to go home. The concept of prisoners requesting to remain in captivity defied his entire understanding of how these situations worked. He asked for clarification, and what followed was an outpouring of carefully suppressed emotions that had been building since the concentration camp revelations. Elsa spoke first, explaining that her Hamburg no longer existed, her family scattered or dead, her previous life erased. Margarete added that returning to Germany meant facing a defeated country that would view captured soldiers as failures and traitors who had been corrupted by enemy influence. Hannah raised a different concern. "We have learned things here," she said carefully in her improving English, "about kindness, about dignity, about what it means to treat people as human beings, regardless of which side they fought on. If we return to Germany now, we will be surrounded by people who still believe the lies, who still blame others for our country's failures. Here, we have been given a chance to become different people than we were. Better people." Greta, the youngest, spoke with surprising maturity. "In Germany, I will always be the girl who served the Reich. Here, I can be someone new, someone who learned from terrible mistakes and chose to do better." The implications were staggering. These were enemy prisoners of war requesting permission to remain in America rather than accept their freedom. Captain Wilson had no framework for handling such a request. He promised to communicate their wishes to his superiors, but warned them that military bureaucracy moved slowly and might not accommodate such an unprecedented situation. The women nodded, understanding that they were asking for something that had perhaps never been asked before. The response from Washington took 3 weeks to arrive, and when it came, it was characteristically bureaucratic and surprisingly flexible. The War Department would not prevent any prisoner from returning to Germany as scheduled. However, given the unusual circumstances at Camp Swift and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, those who wished to delay repatriation could be reclassified as displaced persons. This new status would allow them to remain temporarily in the United States, while applications for immigration status were processed. The catch was significant. They would no longer be wards of the military. They would need civilian sponsors, employment, and housing. The Army would provide 30 days to arrange these necessities, after which they would be released into civilian custody or returned to Germany. Captain Wilson explained the terms to the assembled women, watching their faces shift from hope to concern as they realized the magnitude of what they were attempting. "This isn't like being prisoners anymore," he said carefully. "The military won't house you or feed you. You'll need American families willing to vouch for you, jobs that will employ former enemy nationals, places to live in communities that might not want you there. I won't lie to you, it's going to be harder than staying here has been. The question is whether you're willing to try." 11 women initially expressed interest in attempting to stay. Over the following days, as the reality of the challenge became clearer, that number decreased. 3 decided the uncertainty was too overwhelming and chose the relative security of repatriation. 2 others received letters from Germany indicating that family members had survived, pulling them back toward home despite their ambivalence. That left 6 women: Elsa, Margarete, Hannah, Greta, Anna Weber, and a quiet radio operator named Frida Brandt, who had spoken little during her captivity, but had been profoundly transformed by the kindness she experienced. The news of their decision spread quickly through the nearby communities, generating reactions that ranged from supportive to hostile. Several local newspapers ran editorials questioning why Nazi prisoners should receive special treatment when American soldiers were still dying in the Pacific. Radio commentators in Austin and San Antonio debated whether accepting former enemy nationals set a dangerous precedent. But other voices rose in defense. Church groups who had visited the camp wrote letters to editors describing the women's obvious transformation and genuine remorse. Mrs. Henderson gave an interview to the Bastrop newspaper, declaring that if good Christian people couldn't offer redemption to those who sought it, then they didn't understand Christianity at all. Jake Morrison and Sarah discussed the situation over dinner one evening. His wife had met Elsa several times during her visits to the camp and had been impressed by the young woman's intelligence and sincerity. "We have that spare room," Sarah said carefully, watching her husband's face. "The one we built hoping for children who never came. It seems to me that room has been waiting for a purpose." Jake reached across the table and took his wife's hand, understanding without further words being necessary that they had just decided to become sponsors for a former enemy soldier. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day arrived with church bells ringing across America, but at Camp Swift, the celebration was muted and complicated. For the German women preparing for repatriation, it meant returning to a defeated homeland. For the 6 who had chosen to stay, it meant the end of their prisoner status and the beginning of an uncertain new life. The paperwork had been processed with surprising efficiency once local sponsors stepped forward. Jake and Sarah Morrison had claimed responsibility for Elsa. Dr. Hayes, the camp physician who had worked closely with Hannah, arranged for her to continue medical training under his supervision. Mrs. Henderson offered Margarete a position, helping manage her farm and housing in a cottage on the property. Tommy Chen's family had agreed to sponsor Anna Weber, offering her work at their Houston restaurant while she improved her English. Miguel Rodriguez's extended family, after lengthy discussions, decided to sponsor both Greta and Frida, bringing them to work on the family ranch where they would learn American cattle operations. Each arrangement required extensive documentation, character references, and promises of financial support. The process revealed how deeply the relationships between guards and prisoners had evolved over 8 months of shared coffee and growing mutual respect. The final day at Camp Swift was emotionally complex. The women who were returning to Germany packed their few belongings, uncertain what they would find, but determined to face it with courage. They embraced the women who were staying, promising to write and maintain connections across the ocean. Captain Wilson presided over a brief ceremony, shaking each woman's hand and wishing them well, whether they were boarding trucks for the port or cars heading to civilian homes. His voice was rough with emotion as he told them they had changed his understanding of what it meant to be enemies and what it meant to find common humanity even in the midst of war. Elsa climbed into Jake Morrison's truck with a small cardboard suitcase containing everything she owned. 3 changes of clothes, the letters from her mother, her precious notebook filled with English vocabulary and diary entries, and a tin cup from the morning coffee ritual that Jake had told her to keep. As they drove away from Camp Swift toward the Morrison Ranch, Elsa watched the barbed wire and guard towers disappear behind them. She was no longer a prisoner, but she wasn't yet certain what she was becoming. An immigrant? A refugee? A Texan? The categories seemed inadequate for the transformation she had undergone. The Morrison Ranch was modest, 160 acres of rolling land with a small house, barn, and cattle pens. Sarah Morrison greeted Elsa at the door with a warm embrace that surprised them both. "Welcome home," Sarah said simply, and Elsa realized that this woman had just given her something she thought she had lost forever, a place to belong. Over the following months, Elsa learned to ride horses, mend fences, and help with the endless work of running a ranch. 25 years later, on a warm spring morning in 1970, Elsa Morrison stood in the kitchen of the ranch house she now owned. Jake had passed away 3 years earlier, followed by Sarah just 6 months after him. They had left the ranch to Elsa in their will, along with a letter explaining that she had been the daughter they never had, and that no one deserved the land more than someone who understood what it meant to find home after losing everything. Elsa had married a neighboring rancher in 1952, raised 2 children who spoke English without accents, and knew Germany only through their mother's carefully edited stories, and become a respected member of the Bastrop community. But this morning, she was preparing for a special gathering. The other 5 women who had stayed were coming to the ranch, along with several of the guards who had shaped their transformation, and even Captain Wilson, now retired and living in Austin. They gathered annually on this date, the anniversary of their release from Camp Swift, to remember and to honor what had happened to them. Miguel Rodriguez arrived first, his hair now gray but his posture still straight. He brought Greta and Frida, both of whom had married into his extended family and now ran successful cattle operations of their own. Tommy Chen came with Anna Weber Chen, whom he had married in 1948 after years of friendship evolved into something deeper. Mrs. Henderson arrived with Margarete, who had eventually bought the farm from the Henderson family and transformed it into one of the most productive agricultural operations in the county. Hannah came separately, driving herself from the hospital in Austin, where she now served as director of nursing. Captain Wilson was the last to arrive, walking slowly with a cane, but still possessing the military bearing that had defined his career.